Hello, guys, and welcome back to the Writing Craft Podcast. I'm your host, Jenna.
And I am your host, Holly. It is great to see you all again.
Yes, we're really excited. We just this past week, in the past for you guys, announced the podcast to put out the first episode. So we're very thrilled with your guys' responses and love on the episode so far. So now it's obviously in the future, but I hope you guys are still enjoying it. And in sign of celebration, I feel like we're both talking about something we're really passionate about today, which is world building.
Yes, it's one of my favorite things. And I mean, we're both in the fantasy realm, so that's kind of our jam. And also, when this airs, it'll be the start of NaNoWriMo, November. So I think that it's going to be a very appropriate thing to start you off with if any of you are participating in National Novel Writing Month. And I'm very excited about it. I love talking about this in terms of, Preptober, while you're writing, all of that. And there's so much to get into. I feel like with every topic, there's a lot to get into, but this one especially.
Yeah, definitely. We could do a whole episode, I feel like, on Nano, so we'll probably save next week's for that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we could definitely do that because I have some plans that I don't know if I'm going to execute on correctly or well at all, but I am excited for them.
Yeah, me too. I'm starting this in our, podcast time machine. Going back right now, I'm starting my live streams up again on my channel. So when this comes out, I will be doing my sprinting streams and stuff actively through November, and looking forward to being very productive, I hope.
Yeah, one of the things I definitely wanted to try and do too was some Saturday sprints, because it's been a long time since I went live. So I'll probably either jump on yours or go and host my own on and off throughout the month. So that sounds fan-friggin-tastic. Fantastic. Wow, if I could talk.
Yeah, and if you're doing them, I'll for sure try to hop on yours as well.
Well, world building. For context here, we both love world building, as we said before. I'm mostly right now writing fantasy, but I do have experience writing sci-fi for 6 years. So kind of understand both of them there. And there's a lot of crossover, I feel like, between world building for fantasy and for sci-fi, but there's also just the smallest but biggest differences between the two. But no matter if you're writing fantasy and, world building is required no matter what genre you're writing. It's required, in contemporary, it's, required in fantasy, whether it be like portal fantasy or, quote unquote higher fantasies, or if it is something more like contemporary. And people have a problem I've noticed with world building. They either love it or they hate it. And a lot of people who hate it tend to write more like contemporary or urban things, or things that aren't even like in the spectrum of speculative. But a lot of times I feel like that's why stories sometimes fall flat, is because it's still missing that element, because you still need it no matter your genre. Even if it's a contemporary romance, even if it's a historical, especially, like no matter what you're writing, you need world building. You can't just skip it.
I think that's an important point, because a lot of people don't really understand the definition of world building. And even I would say I didn't fully when I first sort of entered into the world of writing education online. Because for me, I'm very much in my specific world, right? So it was like, I know what I'm doing for this fantasy stuff. I'm, building languages, building different races, working on fantasy characters and lands and all of that. And when I started talking about this with my partner, Pei, who does not at all write fantasy, we talked about the different kinds of world building and just sort of expanded both of our viewpoints. And it was cool to see how world building is executed in a non-fantasy novel. But at the same time, I think a lot of people associate that term with fantasy so much. So people who aren't in that realm, they're like, well, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not creating fantastical things. I'm not in some, D&D game. But world building is just, it's, literally building the world that you are writing in, even if that is a contemporary, like modern world. If you're just, in the city you live in, you're going to be world building within that. You've got to do it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people also think that if it's not in a fantasy or sci-fi setting or anything speculative at all, then it automatically is going to just be, oh, world building is the same as setting. And I'm like, not
Yeah, yeah.
necessarily. You could write something in a, a town that actually exists. You're actually doing mostly research about a place that is in existence in modern time, so you don't have to imagine all that much in terms of, creating it yourself. But there is an element of like, okay, well, they're
Mhm.
neighbors, like of the person who lives in this town. You can't actually choose real people unless you're writing like an actual like memoir. But for the most part, world building is so much deeper than that. It's like it's the world not only as it is, but is the world how your character sees it, right? So the world,
Mhm.
the way that they describe it is going to be different than the way their neighbors or their friend or their lover describe that world. So you're describing and, creating the world through which they live and they interact in the world that has shaped your characters, but also the way that they see their world, especially if you're in first person, because you're only
Mhm.
viewing the world through their eyes and their eyes only, unless you're doing dual POV or third person. But if it's first person world, first person character, first person story, everything is colored with the biases that that person grew up with and the views that they have, and the reason that they look at everything that way is because of the world that they grew up in. But if you don't know any of this, sometimes the world and the character can seem disconnected and like they don't make sense. And it's like you can't really have
Mhm.
character building when you don't have the world building to back up why your character is that way.
Yeah, exactly. When you're writing, you want to pull your reader in and you want them feel immersed in the story. And if you don't have a fully fleshed out world, how are they going to be immersed in that world?
Yeah, I mean, world building is really just fleshing out, every aspect of how the world came to be. And so many people love, they're like, oh yeah, I get to make my little fantasy worlds. But they're more so focusing on the characters, which sure is that, we end up loving the characters. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of the reason why people read stories to begin with, is to fall in love with the characters. But it can go so much deeper than that if you actually genuinely think about, okay, well, I love this character, but why are they the way that they are? If you don't have a reason for why they are the way that they are, you don't have their backstory, like all of these things flow into the world building because that's part of the world that you've created.
Yeah, like what are the elements that are influencing this person or people from the outside? Because there are always going to be these things in the outside world that are going to affect you and push the story along. And I'm someone who loves characters. My first love is character creation, character building. But you can't really have a character that's just completely isolated. I mean, you can do anything, but even in isolation, there's a world within that. Why are they isolated, right?
Like even if you have a character just sitting in a padded room, like there's, why are they in the padded room? Who put them in the padded room? Do they put themselves in the padded room? What clothes are they wearing? What's the padded room made out of? Like all of these different things can hint to the world inside of the character and the world outside of the character and outside of the room that they're in. There's a movie, I think, I'm forgetting what it's called, but I think it might just be called The Box. It's with Jake Gyllenhaal, and it terrified me as a child.
Oh
But the
yeah.
whole movie takes place with him inside of a coffin, and the only communication he has with the outside
Oh my
world is a
god.
cell phone. But through his contacts on his phone, through the way that he's communicating with people to try and have them find him, you find out more about his past and his story and his hopes for his future, as well as like how he even got in the box in the first place. But there's no like before story, there's no like after image, because the entire thing is just him in the box. It opens up with him in the dark
Mm.
trying to find a lighter in his pocket so he can see. And when he turns on the lighter, that's when you can see like anything on the screen.
Hmm.
So
That's
even with that movie, you
fascinating.
can still have world building in a in a locked room, but you don't want your characters just floating around aimlessly like talking heads with just white blank space around them, and you can't imagine anything. You can't feel like the setting is tactile. You don't feel like anything makes sense for the political system or the spirituality in the novel, whatever it may be that's outside of the character that influences the character. If there's no connection, that's where a lot of stories fall flat.
And that example you gave is great, a great example of the whole iceberg theory about how much the reader or the viewer is going to see in the story and how much the writer
Yeah.
knows. So it's one of the things that I've always thought was fun about world building is just how much you as the author are going to know about what you're writing and how it colors what you do and how it's not all going to be shown to the reader. And I don't know, maybe that's like sadistic of me, but I really kind of like that.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of like that secret world you have within yourself, and like someone gets to visit it in your story,
Mm.
but you get to live in it in your head. And so you, as the author, kind of have that privilege, and you get to choose how much of it you share with readers at any given time, which is something really, really special. But there's so many writers, I feel like,
Mm-hmm.
who they want to just do the bare minimum. They only want to figure out what's necessary to tell the story, which some people can get away with that. But for
Yeah.
people who are diehard, especially speculative fans who write science fiction and fantasy, like, they want to go deeper with the story. And sometimes, like, let's say, for example, you're like, oh no, I'm going to do the bare minimum with my book. It gets published, it blows up like on TikTok or something. And people want more and more and more content about your world. They want a spin-off, they want a sequel, they want this, and you don't have enough content already created to back it up. So people are just waiting, and you might throw things in there that don't make sense, that leave them going, hey, this isn't what we signed up for. You might, do things that contradict and retcon your own writing because you didn't set up your world for success in the early days. So there might be some things that like literally no one ever finds out about your world and only you get to know. But isn't that such like, for people who hate world building, I'm talking directly to you, but like, isn't that such like a pleasure and like a joy to know like I'm sharing my book with the world, but there's still some things I get to keep for myself, because in so few areas when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to writing do you get to keep something like 100% yours.
That is very true. When you're putting it out into the world, you're, bleeding all over the page. So like there's your soul right out there, but at least with a in-depth world, you have a couple little things. And that's also a really good thing to say about the content element of it, because we have talked in previous episodes about how how much marketing you have to do now as a writer, how much marketing and promotion and stuff, and how you can't just write. You have to be, the total package, whether you're indie or trad published. And having that mass amount, if you have a whole binder, like a 500-page binder, and your book is 200 pages, that's great, because you can pull on all of that stuff anytime. You've got lots of little Easter eggs, you've got lots of things to go, maybe I do want to show this now. Maybe I'm going to divulge this, or, maybe I'll use this for a novella or a sequel. And it's very useful.
Yeah, definitely. And like, we're not saying you have to have like so much world building done in like an actual physical series
No, no,
Bible. It's totally up to you how much world building that you do. We just
that's just my just my dream
that's the
world
way we
building.
operate.
That's me projecting.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
I get that. But like, obviously do what works best for you and for your writing. But if you're feeling like readers are going, oh,
Yeah.
your story's falling flat, it feels like they have like white talking head broom syndrome, other, things like this that readers might be pointing out, it might be time to do a little bit more deeper world building. And these are just like our recommendations. But that's a fantastic point they're making there, because I have so much, and I mean so much, from when I was writing Spaceborne, my sci-fi, queer space opera, so much over the years that I kept in world building that I knew I could pull for the rest of the books. So it helped me literally plan out like the like whole three first books. I knew like exactly basically what's going to happen for 3 to 6 books in the series, because there's so much content world building that I
Mm-hmm.
did that I can pull from. Like I hinted on at like page 35 in book one, and I can pull it for book five, you know? And so that's still something far
Yeah.
off, but there's even like a whole document I have of teasers from the book. So like little like Easter eggs. So it's like, you don't know this, but actually I named this chapter because it has this exact amount of pages, and that is a reference to something else. Like this really, really subtle like hints and things. So like there's a this is the reason why I love beta readers, but I have this amazing beta reader who's read Spaceborne twice now, just because like they wanted to, and they were like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, I read it the first time years ago, you're doing it like your final beta round, I want in. And she's made me like, fan art of stuff before, and she's looking freaking
Oh.
incredible. Yeah, she like makes actual like book covers for like trade pub books now, and I'm like amazed by her talent all the
Oh,
time.
that's
And I feel
awesome.
so lucky that like she loved the book. But she was one of, like,
Mm-hmm.
she's the only person who read the book who has ever noticed one Easter egg that I have on that document. There's one that was like my favorite Easter egg that you know, when I was editing, I made sure to keep in it. Over the course of like 5 years, I kept this one Easter egg in it that was really hard because it was a certain
Mm-hmm.
number of chapter numbers. And so I had to keep the book at a certain number of chapters for that Easter egg. And so it kind of made it a bitch to edit. But I was like, I'm doing it because during my first bit around, she noticed and she knew. So other people are going to notice. And I literally have that on that doc. And out of all of those Easter eggs on the doc, this is the only one that's ever been noticed by one person. And that's all it took. I was like, that's it. That makes me so happy. So like to this day, there's only one.
You've been
Yes.
validated. See, personally, I love that kind of thing so much. And with Eternity, my I don't know if I've mentioned this one actually in the podcast. I've mentioned my fantasy epic Centera, but I have a semi fantasy. I don't know, like they're magic workers, but it's
Oh.
historical and there's kind of like I guess it's like fantasy history. It came a lot out of the anime world when I was big into that in high school, and I had a friend and we wrote a 9,000 plus word RPG, and I boiled it down into like something real. And so in the process of this, like certainly there's tons of world building and character building that went into over 9,000 pun intended but also accidental over 9,000 pages of role play game. um, but as I was sort of outlining and adding stuff in, I was looking at characters that had been side characters and their history and trying to build that out. And I never really thought they'd be a main character. And there were actually two of them who just exponentially grew. So one, I started writing a novella about just because I was delving into her history because I was like, well, there's this span of like 1,000 years where we don't know where she
Oh.
was, and like there's immortals in this. I'm like, I kind of need to figure out some stuff in here just so we know a little bit about what she's doing so that she doesn't become one of those immortal characters that's not properly developed where they just sort of throw things out from different eras without any real continuity. I'm like, no, I want to have an actual timeline of what she was doing. And once I started getting into that, I'm like, oh no, I actually love her so much, and now I want to make a whole like little novella about this character. So you could just like, it just builds and builds and builds. And another one, I wound up, he was the catalyst for combining two of my universes together. So Centera and Eternity actually have connections to one another through this one character who now appears in both. So again, people who aren't too into world building, just like open your mind up to the possibilities because it could be huge.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like people who have the ability to like they love world building, they have the ability to stay in it for a long time, they have the ability to like combine
Mm.
different book worlds, they have the ability to go and like make spin-offs and things. But for so many like writers who don't like world building, they've completely closed that option off because they're not diving into the depths of what like could be. They're only looking at what
Hmm.
is, just for the sake of getting something on the page. Which, if you're just wanting to write just for like the
Yeah.
sake of writing, if you're just writing for like what you enjoy, none of this appeals to you, then like be my guest. But these things are, at least for me, like what get me so freaking excited, because like I have the same thing where
Yeah.
I think almost all of my fantasy novels that are in a different world take place in the same world. So I have like headcanons in my
Hmm.
head that like this main character over here is actually half siblings with the love interest from this book, and like
Yeah.
different crossovers
Yeah.
I can do with that, which are really, really cool and fun. But it also makes it so that like I have, for example, one set of magic system, right? I created it once. I don't technically
Hmm.
really have to create it again. The only difference that is really happening with all of these books is that it's taking place on completely other sides of the planet, on the globe, the fictional globe that I created. So they're so far away from each other that they have different mythologies still. They have, very little or lack of communication with each other. And so they call the same thing different things. And it sometimes works differently based off of their
Hmm.
environment or their religion or other things like that. But so I can get away with using a very similar set of rules across the board and having to only create it, once, but then being able to play in that
Yeah.
world still infinitely is really fun. Um, so one of the things you said there too about like finding, what she's doing for those 1,000 years that she was, doing whatever she was doing. I had to do something really, really similar
Hmm.
in one of the books that I'm writing right now, which is I'm calling my East West Whip. And that is technically not, a higher
Yes.
quote unquote fantasy. It's more of like a slightly futuristic, because I think it's happening in like 2050, something like that. And
Hmm.
it's happening in, a small, excuse me, a small mysterious Canadian town on Vancouver Island. And
Yes.
so this town has kind of generational curses. It has, a little bit of reincarnation going on. And so I was like, okay, I need to know when people were like reincarnated, when specific people in bloodlines were alive
Right.
to interact with each other. And so I had to
Mhm.
go through and do the horrible thing called math to go back like 1,000 years
Oh, no.
to when the curse in the
Yeah.
town first began, and had to basically figure out an entire bloodline for my main character going back 1,000 years. So this is like 40
Mhm.
generations. I didn't name.
Oh my god. I have done this with all the family trees and
Yeah,
oh
the
god.
family
Yep.
trees are so fun. I have to do it for a couple different characters, but I've only done it for the main character so far. And now that I've done the math once, I
Mm.
can kind of copy it over because I can know, okay, if in her 10th great grandmother, I want there to be a backstory about a specific thing that happened with this other character, then I know that that character has to be alive at the same time, right?
Mm.
So it's so intriguing because then when I'm looking down, I'm going, okay, well, there's specific characters at specific marks in time that I know I want to like either have like a flashback or like an excerpt from them, or like they find the written journal from different, members of her family going back
Mm.
generations.
Yeah.
But now that I have this, I know the exact, ages of the characters, that when they were born, when they died. And then what I did was I looked at, okay, well, what was happening historically at the time? Because it is taking place in this world. And this is why people who do contemporary fantasy or contemporary novels can also add a little bit of history in there, because I'm a history buff. I love history. So I'd literally look at like,
Yes.
oh, well, her third great grandmother was alive during this World War, or like the Civil War, or, all these other historical things, and I can weave that into the narrative of her family members and make it feel just a little bit more real versus just saying, "Oh yeah, she was alive in the
Mhm.
early 1900s. Nothing happened to her." I'm sorry. Do you know the early 1900s?
She was just there.
You got
Yeah.
smallpox. You got influenza. You've got the World War I. You
Yeah,
got
like some
swingers.
some shit was going on.
Yeah. So I'm like, if you don't know, and that's an example of like history being our own world building. So if you're having a story that's more contemporary in nature,
Yes.
adding those elements in makes it feel just a little bit more real versus if, you're just like, they were alive at a period in time that is undisclosed, and they did things that are undisclosed because I don't know what they would be doing at this point in time. I'm like, okay, well, if they're born in 2001, how about let's talk about like 9/11, being impactful for them, maybe,
Mhm.
maybe if they were 90s kids, you can talk about them being a
Yeah.
90s baby. And, sometimes as your book gets older, those references will kind of like date it a little bit. So that is, a potential issue. But for you saying like, oh yeah, I had an ancestor who was a part of the Revolutionary War. Okay, well, that's not, exact enough that it's going to date your book, but it's also real enough that it's going to make it feel more authentic.
Yeah, and that's why I hesitate when I talk about eternity to say that it's like fantasy or something because it is heavily historical. So like these characters start out in ancient Rome and Egypt. So I really cut out my work for myself. Because I sort of have to look at world history starting at that point, which is, it's a little while ago. Um, but it has its contemporary elements and its historic elements. So there's a lot of research in it. And it's like, I could see the various types of research you would put in a bunch of different genres and a bunch of modern day things as well, too. So like I think you really just want to have a grasp. If you are writing in the real world, you're not creating a fantasy world, you're not building your own world. You have to have a grasp on the world that we are in, or the time that you are writing in.
Definitely. And, one of those things is history. Another one of those things is, like biases. Different one of those things is, if you're basing it in our real
Mm-hmm.
world, you have to realize that your view yourself, like you are a character, the way you grew up specifically is coloring your view of the world. But if you're writing from the perspective of someone who lives in Australia, for example, in the same world, they're
Mm-hmm.
going to have still a different, background. And that's why a lot of people too, they're like, can we not have, what was it? What did I read? Picture paper colored authors writing Black stories.
Oh
I
yeah.
think I saw that tweet, and I was like, that's a completely valid thing because, like, for us color paper printer colored, writers, we're not going to have the same experiences, and we're going to have, biases that are completely opposite to, authors of color, and they should get to write their stories first, obviously, like before anybody else does. And then on top of that, like, we don't have their experiences. Why should we? Because our biases and our experiences are automatically going to color our way that we write stories. There was a blow up on Twitter recently about a white author who's been writing Black fantasy novels and saying that apparently their Black characters are using bacon grease in their hair just because they heard
Oh,
that black people use
see,
grease,
like,
and so they assumed it was bacon.
here's you're the research, the research. So like I'm of the mind that you should be able to explore anything you want in writing, no matter what background you come from, but that if you're going to explore someone who is like, has a completely different history and worldview experiences from you need to heavily research that, like really heavily. And the thing is, there's no excuse anymore not to
Yeah.
do that with the access we have to the internet. So like the site so when I was growing up, I did write very like close to my experiences. So, a lot of white characters, a lot of sort of European, even though I'm Slavic, but sort of European background. I romanticized like the Moors of England. So that was my main focus. But when I wrote my first book that I put out, A Time When Demons, the love interest is African American, and I was like, I need to write him correctly. I don't want to, reference, ways that he looks, like his hair and things like that, in terminology that might actually be offensive. And the thing is, there are amazing websites on this, and I forget the name of it, but if I remember, we'll
I'm
link
pretty
it or
sure it's writing
something.
with
But it's
color.
like right.
Yeah.
Probably it, yeah, it probably is. And I just, I look through these sites. I'm like, okay, here's terminology I can use. I can read about the history. I can read about all these things, and it's great because it expands your personal worldview too. Because now I know more about this character's background, and I know more about people around me when I interact with them and stuff. So it can just be this really helpful thing. And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people still get it wrong somehow.
Yeah, well, I think it's because they're, one, not willing to do the research, but then also two, a lot of people who don't like world building, they don't like research, and so they automatically, if they are going to write from a,
Hmm.
about or from a perspective that isn't their own in any way, shape, or form, especially from a
Yeah.
person of color, a minority, disabled, like whatever it may be, then they're just going to color it with their own
Hmm.
biases. And if you're growing up, especially like a white cis hetero man in a Western society, you know, we have so many problematic books now coming out from those authors and that have been out from those authors for such a long time. That's why people have asked, like, just don't write it right now because, like, if you're getting published and people who are from that perspective aren't getting published, one, that's fucked up. And then two, like in the trade world, obviously, because there's a limited amount of stories they allow to come
Hmm.
out.
Yeah.
In indie, it's a little bit
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but so there's that as a problem. But then there's like, okay, well, you don't like world building and you don't like research, and then you have to look at like kind of the person and just be like, okay, well, which one of your books is going to become the problematic one? Because either you're trying to steer away so much from research that you have no world building, you don't have any characters that don't look, sound, or act like you because you don't want to research them properly, or the opposite of that is that you write them ways and you write them
Yeah.
really, really poorly, and then everybody doesn't like you and cancels you. And so it's basically setting yourself
Yeah.
up for failure.
That's true.
Well, I noticed too, like, so many people who are in this boat of like, I don't like world building, I don't like, doing research, I don't like this. It's because they're so comfortable in their own perspective. And so when they don't like when they have to face perspectives that are not the same as theirs, they get really uncomfortable. And so it's like the whole white guilt factor of it. Like, oh,
Hmm.
I don't like to learn about history because the white people are the bad guys. I'm like, okay, well, maybe in a lot of those, but you really have to look at history because everybody has been a bad guy. And if you're feeling so much guilt, it's probably because you've been
Oh,
super racist or something.
100%.
I'm just saying. If you're feeling the white guilt, you've probably been racist. And that's what you're feeling guilty over. It's not what your fifth great
Yeah.
grandmother on your father's ninth side did,
In
you know?
in my experience, that is what I've seen. The people who are the guiltiest, it's usually for some sort of
Yeah.
reason.
So,
uh, but yeah, and I mean, like, if you think, I think one important thing to say is if you're including a character who's outside of your worldview for for
yeah.
points, don't
Yeah.
do that. Like, if you genuinely want this character in your story to the point where you are going to be compassionate and interested in genuinely learning and truly incorporating them into your story, please,
Yeah.
yes. If you're gonna talk to people, you're gonna learn, you're like I said, gonna expand your own worldview, awesome. Like do that through fiction. It's great to learn through your own writing. But if you're gonna go, oh, let's do like a diversity character in here and throw a token character in and just like, that's not gonna work. It's not gonna work for the story. It's not gonna work for you. Everyone's gonna understand and no one's gonna
Yeah.
like it.
No, I think too, one of the ways that I, dealt with this, aspect of it was that I found, as I was writing, for example, Spaceborne, I was like, okay, I am already writing aliens. I'm writing about space a couple hundred years from now. Like, there's going to be so much blending of people. Like, people who look like me aren't really going to exist anymore. And we are a mutation, so that's probably genetically for the best. Let's face it.
It's already happening.
So I was like, okay, so let's flip that trope on its head, and my character in Spaceborne is basically the token white character. There's one other and only one white straight person in the entire book, and that's not the main character. My character is bi and neurodiverse. So there's really just one like token white hetero cis man, and he's, spoiler, not really a great guy. But then meanwhile,
I mean, that is how it's gonna be. Like that's how it's gonna progress for sure.
Because at that rate, you're looking at, a couple hundred years from now, and you're like, well, why are you like, none of your family has ever dated outside of your race before? That's not, for no reason.
Yeah, like exactly. Like at that point, that's a little concerning.
And even with my my character Soraya Larson, I tried to like hint at her own mixed background because she comes across really pale, but her name is Soraya, which is more Middle Eastern, and then her last name's Larson, which is Scandinavian. So for that's a little bit of a hint that like she's not fully white, but she comes across very white. But meanwhile, he has like a super duper just white Americanized name, and he's kind of like my MAGA guy, in the book, but in the like future version of it, but then meanwhile, I was like, okay, well, we have aliens and humans are kind of demonizing aliens, and then we have, a lot of the other characters are from, backgrounds that have been demonized by white people for a long time. So we had, a hijabi character, there was, a gay Christian character, there was a Jewish character who was a doctor, like there's a bunch of other people on her team who she knows who are either aliens who are demonized for the species they come from, the religion they come from, all these other things. And then you had, the human characters who come from backgrounds that right now, in our modern day world aren't, appreciated or, are demonized in a lot of different ways. And so it was kind of an easy way to parallel a lot of their conflicts together. But I did so much research to be able to write characters.
As you were listing that, I was like adding up how many hours of research you would have to do for all. And I had this. And it's something like, okay, you'd want to get into that because it is all so fascinating, but my God, the work.
Oh yeah, and that's why a lot of people don't want to do it, because they just want to spit out the story. But then at the very least during the editing process,
but like the end result.
I mean, if you're a lot of people too, I realized I had this problem in self-publishing because you have to like publish, you have to get your books out faster, but then there's a lot of problems in trade publishing as well, because they also are putting you on a deadline. And so you're not able to do these things. You're not, and then when you're going trade, you can't share your story as widely as other people can either. But for me, I was lucky enough that when I had betas, I also had sensitivity readers. So I had, 2 Muslim hijabi sensitivity readers who absolutely loved and adored Camilla and gave me so much advice. And they were like, oh my God, I love that you, like, for example, they at one point go to like a club and they were so happy she did not take off her hijab because they had both apparently read it might have been one of them, or it might have been both, I'm not sure, but apparently one of them had read a different story where during a club scene the hijabi character had taken off their hijab to go clubbing and worn like a short outfit.
That makes no sense.
Yeah, and I was like, that makes no sense. I didn't even have to research this is logically doesn't make sense.
Oh, I don't care anymore, I'm at the club.
And so
at the club, I don't care anymore. YOLO.
But I made very, very sure that like she was still like dressed up, but like she wasn't all of a sudden gonna like expose things that like a hijabi person wouldn't be showing, and so they were like super duper happy about that. And I was like, that to me is like the bare minimum. Like I should not be getting like any sort of praise for doing the bare fucking minimum, where if you're going to write a character not from your own background, you do the fucking research. And that's just logic. But a lot of the times I feel like people don't want to see from perspectives that are outside of their own, and so then they don't want to write worlds and research worlds or research characters or come up with characters that are outside of their worldview because it makes them uncomfortable. And, you know, at the same
Mhm.
time, we also have tons of people who are like, okay, well, I'm going to write a fantasy world so I can make everybody from this culture I like, but I can just say it's a fantasy world and I can make them all white. But I can just steal from real life
Mhm.
culture so I don't have to actually learn anything or come up with anything creatively.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely, has a tendency to happen.
Yeah. One of my favorite things to do though is just to like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm writing like a fantasy world. I really like the example I always give is that I love the way that the like channels go through Italy and they have like the little boats and they have the buildings really close together.
Oh, in
Yeah.
Venice and stuff,
So I
yeah.
love that aspect, but let's say I really like the idea of like a quinceanera in Mexico. Oh, I really love the idea of the maypole in
Mhm.
Scandinavia. Well, what if I combine all of those things into, you know, one town with a big festival that has a bunch of these different things together and it's a really diverse location with a bunch of different people who've all mingled together and it's set in a fantasy world that's not mine. I think that's cool because you're getting inspired by stuff. You're not just literally appropriating something from a culture so that you can do the minimal amount of effort to just make something and call it fantasy.
That is such a good tip. Such a good like a little bit more in depth. I love that because instantly when you were saying that, I got inspired. I'm like, yeah, I need to get back into writing my fantasy story. And that is such a good idea. Just to, if you are writing fantasy, don't just use that as an excuse, rather, purposefully or not on purpose, to just like be aware of what you're doing. It's like, am I just taking this thing that I know and sort of translating it and being lazy and making that into the fantasy thing? Or am I really trying to make something unique and diverse and appealing that is sort of outside of the norm and more
Yeah.
creative?
Well, also, I gotta head to the gym like ASAP. So anything we want to leave off on, but we could
Oh,
go on this for like forever. I feel like
I think we should, since this is going to be a slightly shorter one and it's been very conversational, I think we should actually do a part
yes,
two because world building is so big and we can sort of say this is a teaser for that.
yeah, I like that.
Perfect. So anyone listening can look forward to, things you can actually utilize in your writing as you work on National Novel
Yeah,
Writing Month.
definitely. And if you guys are writing something, do let us know what you're writing down below.
Yes, please.
All right, we'll see you guys in the next one. Katara will see you in the next one too if you're watching on the virtual.
Thanks for listening.